Our first featured presentation will be from one of my coworkers. Dr. Valerie Neal is curator of the Human Spaceflight Collection in the Space History Department here at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum. Please help me welcome Dr. Valerie Neal to the stage.
Well, thank you, and it's good to see everyone here this morning. It's a pleasure to talk to you today about the first women in space. And this has been on our mind here a lot this past month of June because it has been 50 years since the first woman entered space as a cosmonaut and 30 years in June since the first U.S. woman went into space. And so I'd like to tell you a little bit about these three very different women who also had some things in common. Do any in the audience know who the first woman in space was? Okay, excellent. How about the second woman in space? Do you know who that was? The first U.S. woman in space. Everybody knows that, I bet. Well, we'll start back in the beginning of the space era in the 1960s. And as you know, this was a time when the United States and the Soviet Union were competing for first in space. It was a high-stakes competition called the space race, and it was part of the Cold War environment. And the Soviet Union started out with all the first, including the first woman in space. And in fact, they managed to send up a woman and put her in space for 3 days at a time when 3 days was more than all U.S. astronauts combined had spent in space. And that was Valentina Tereshkova. She became a symbol, and in fact probably was selected in large part because of her background. She had basically grown up in the countryside in central Russia. Her father had been a tractor operator. Her mother worked in a cotton mill. Her father had, in fact, died in World War II, and so he was considered a war hero. But she was seen as a representative of the Soviet philosophy and the communist ideology that all were equal and that women had the same opportunities that men had. What distinguished Valentina Tereshkova, though, from the other 400 applicants when the Soviet space program decided to seek women was that she was an avid parachutist. That was her hobby and probably her one indulgence. There was an aero club in her town, and so she became a parachutist at the age of 17. And that bit of experience made her of interest to the Soviet space program, and she was one of 5 candidates who were selected and put into training. She had actually not had much formal schooling. Since her father had died in the war, she had gone to grade school for a couple of years and then dropped out to help her mother and then gone to work herself in that same cotton factory. So she really was a member of what was called the proletariat. And once she was selected to be a cosmonaut, she had to study space flight mechanics, trajectories, the technology of space flight. It was a very technical curriculum, and she stubbornly stuck with it and did very well in the training and consequently was selected to fly. So she made headlines in 1963 in June as the first woman to go into space. While she was in space, she did some experiments on herself because they were interested in learning whether there were any differences in the way the female body adapted and the way the male body adapted. After her flight, she never had another opportunity to fly again, but she was a hero of the Soviet Union. She received all kinds of awards. She's still lionized today. She's in her 70s, but she's still a heroine in their culture. She later became very active in the Communist Party. She served in the national government, and has held a variety of positions both within the Soviet Union and later Russia. And also she was sort of an ambassador around the world for women's causes, and was a symbol of what could be accomplished in the Soviet Union. Of course, the United States did not admit women into the space program in the 1960s. It was 20 years before we had a U.S. woman go into space. But the second woman to enter space was also a cosmonaut, and her name was Svetlana Savitskaya. She was about 11 years younger than Valentina Tereshkova, and she had a much different background. She came from a background of privilege. Her father was a World War II fighter ace, and he was like deputy commander of the Air Force or the Defense Service in the Soviet Union. So she had lived a much different life, and she also developed an early interest in parachuting, and she secretly started taking lessons without her parents' permission when she was about 15. And when her father found out, he was very encouraging and supportive of it, and encouraged her also to take piloting lessons. She then went on, she of course had gone through school, regular school as a child, and she applied and was accepted into the leading aeronautics and engineering university in the Soviet Union. So she spent her time growing up and going to school in Moscow. She was close to the seats of power and influence. She was selected in the second class of female cosmonauts in 1980, and the United States was gearing up for the shuttle program. The United States had already recruited its first class of astronauts, which included 6 women, and the Soviets knew that the U.S. would be putting a woman in space soon, so they decided to kind of beat us to the punch, so to speak, and put another woman up, and they set Svetlana up on a 7-day mission on a Soyuz spacecraft to the Salyut space station, which was already in orbit. And she spent 7 days on the space station with 2 other crew members. Valentina had gone into space alone, I should have said. But Svetlana was part of a 3-person crew, did research on the space station, and then 2 years later, she was sent back again to the Salyut 7 space station, this time to do a spacewalk, to go outside and do some work on the outside of the space station. It was actually a welding experiment. The Soviets had gotten wind that we were about to put a woman outside on a spacewalk, so they accelerated their schedule, and they snagged that first with Svetlana. But she continued after her 2 space flights and a total of 19 days in space to work as an engineer and as a test pilot. She was very accomplished technically. She also held political office in the Communist Party, and she also remains active today in politics, though neither of them is still involved in space flight in any way. She's in her 60s now. And then finally, we get to Sally Ride, the first U.S. woman in space, who was one of 6 women who were selected in 1978 to fly on the shuttle. And these women were different from the previous astronauts, not only by virtue of their gender, but also they did not have to be pilots. For the Space Shuttle program, NASA had decided to recruit scientists and engineers. And of the 6 women who were selected, there were 2 who held medical degrees. They were emergency room physicians, and 4 who held PhDs in several different disciplines: biochemistry, physics, geology and earth sciences, and electrical engineering. Sally Ride was selected to fly first. No one knows exactly why she was selected, but a possibility is that she had been very much involved in development of the remote manipulator arm that is operated by an astronaut to lift satellites out of the payload bay or to grasp satellites like the Hubble Space Telescope and bring them into the payload bay. and also to move astronauts around as they're doing their outside tasks. And that was her area of expertise. She had grown up in California. She was, by her own admission, probably a B student, but she had always loved science and math. And she had also always loved tennis, and she was good enough at tennis to be nationally ranked. So as she came to be of college age, she sort of had a choice to make. Should I try to become a professional tennis player, or should I continue my education in science and become a researcher? And she actually went off to college for a year, left California, was kind of homesick, but she felt this pull of playing tennis as well. So she went back to California and switched schools, entered Stanford University, where she could play tennis for the university and see if she might really be good enough to go pro. At the same time, she immersed herself in a physics curriculum and was preparing to be a physics researcher, though she realized at some point that she was spending too much time in science classes and she needed to feed the other side of her brain, so she started taking English classes too, and she ended up with 2 degrees, one in physics and one in English. So she was really, I think, intellectually a pretty well-balanced person. She had not planned to be an astronaut all her life, but she saw the announcement in the campus newspaper and decided that's something I could do. That's something I would like to do. So she applied, was accepted, went through training with the other 5 women, plus the men who were in that group of 35. And she ended up flying on the 7th Space Shuttle mission, which was in 1983. And you'll see the patch there with the remote manipulator arm in the shape of a 7, and her uniform from that mission is right behind me in the glass case. After her flight, she had a second flight along with the first U.S. woman to do a spacewalk, Kathy Sullivan. Then the Challenger accident occurred, and she became very much involved in determining the causes of that accident and making recommendations to avoid it happening again. After a short period of time, she left NASA. She went back into teaching, became a physics professor back in California at the University of California in San Diego. And then in 2001, she decided to indulge another passion of hers, which was education of young people. And she wanted especially to stimulate young people's interest in science and technical fields. So she founded Sally Ride Science and developed a whole outreach program spread across the country to encourage young people, and especially girls, to discover the sciences and develop an interest, if not a passion, for science. And she was very much involved in that until the time of her untimely death last summer, last July. And it was a shock to everyone that she was gone so soon. She was only 61 and still a major presence. All of these women won lots of awards and received a lot of recognition for what they had accomplished in space. But I think the thing that they had in common was an ability and ultimately a passion for science and technology, for kind of stretching out there into a new area, learning it and mastering it, and then coming into the service of their nation to accomplish feats in space. So keep these women in mind and realize that women were not always in space, but they very much are now and have been since, particularly since the shuttle era began. The Soviets never put any other women in space after Savitskaya. However, we have had about 50 women in space on the shuttle from not only the U.S., but from other countries as well. So one slogan is perhaps a woman's place is in space. Thank you. Do you have any questions or comments about these 3 women or about the roles of women in space generally? I should say, in fact, of course, that being an astronaut is just the most visible way to be a woman in space, but there are many women working behind the scenes on the consoles and mission control, and even more behind the scenes than that, in the laboratories, in the training facilities. There are many women now in the space program supporting the spaceflight effort and contributing to it with their own talents and abilities, as of course there are men.
If anybody has any questions, come on down to the microphone.
Hello, thank you very much. I'm Dave Esslinger. I'm with the North Charleston team. So this was very educational about some of the first women in space, and as you say, there's a lot more now. Do you think there's anything really special now about women in space, or are they serving just doing anything that a man can do in space?
That's a very good question about whether there's anything special. The first women who came into the U.S. Astronaut Corps did not want to be distinguished as women. They did not want any special accommodations. They didn't want any of the requirements to be changed because of them. They wanted to be and felt as if they were, in fact, equals and equivalents to the men. However, in point of fact, some accommodations did need to be made, both on the ground and in space. And some of them seem trivial now in retrospect, but they were important. For example, in the astronaut fitness facility, and all the astronauts have to be very physically fit. They have to exercise daily. Well, in the gym, there was no female locker room. And so NASA had to modify the facility. Another interesting example of a difference is most of the men who go into space have short hair. A lot of the women don't. Some cut their hair before they fly, but a lot of them prefer to leave their hair as it is, and so hair blossoms out all around you in space, and that can be an issue. It can tickle the nose of the person next to you because you're in such close quarters, or it could get tangled up on knobs and switches. So NASA had to develop a policy saying that long hair needed to be confined in space. So you have to have a ponytail or a clip or a scrunchie if you have long hair, but you can take your hair down sometime just to take a cool picture. And then sometimes women kind of led the way, just in a way by being practical in some ways that brought a new insight into the space program. And this is a topic everybody always giggles about, but I'll bring it up, and that is, how do you go to the bathroom when you're wearing a spacesuit? And you're strapped in your seat in the space shuttle or the Soyuz for a while before launch and for a while before reentry. Or if you go outside on a spacewalk, an extravehicular activity, you're out there for 8 hours. How do you go to the bathroom? Well, the men had a system already that dated all the way back to the Mercury days of essentially kind of having a tube and bag built into their spacesuit so they could urinate if they needed to. That didn't work for women. So what would the solution be? And so the women kind of figured it out for themselves, and this was in the early 1980s, late 1970s, and disposable diapers had come on the market for babies, and they were just coming on the market for adults, disposable underwear for people who might need that. And so the women said, let's try this out and see if it works. And it worked great for them, and it had the added benefit of giving them a little bit of comfort padding when they were on the launch pad, sitting on their backs, basically, with their legs up in the air, waiting for launch because, the shuttle was upright. And so they were very comfortable. The men were having a hard time. Their backs were hurting, and if they did have to urinate, it was messy when things were kind of pointed up. The tube might leak. So lo and behold, the men started trying the disposable underwear, the so-called diapers, and now that's what they all wear. So I think there was give and take between men and women, but they all reportedly said that they always felt like they were integrated into the astronaut corps, that their jobs were the same whether they were men or women. It just so happens that many of the women became remote manipulator system operators. There might be something about good hand-eye coordination among women. A lot of the men were EVA specialists, though there were a few women, but that required more strength and, in general, a little bit larger body.
Well, let's thank Dr. Neal.